Hello viewers, welcome to this video. In this video, let's take a look at a tool called Kubescape. Kubescape is an open source Kubernetes security platform. So it can be installed inside Kubernetes cluster. It can be used in your CI/CD pipelines. And you can also use this as an extension in some of the IDEs. So I've read through the documentation and it seems like they've got an extension for Visual Studio Code. So using this, you can scan your live Kubernetes cluster for any misconfigurations, any security compliance, any vulnerabilities, or any issues that you might have with your Kubernetes cluster or with the resources deployed in your Kubernetes cluster. So it not only scans your live Kubernetes cluster, but you can also use it to scan, for example, if you've got a directory full of Kubernetes manifest, and you can do a static code analysis kind of thing, statically analyze the entire directory where you've got all your manifest to find out if there are any misconfigurations, any vulnerabilities issues. So it gives you an idea of scanning the code before actually deploying it to the Kubernetes cluster. So I would advise doing that instead of doing a scan after you've deployed it into the cluster. It's always a good practice to do it before you deploy it to the cluster. So sometimes it can be quite expensive to do it inside the cluster. If you find some vulnerabilities and if you want to fix it, then once you've deployed it into the Kubernetes cluster, depending on how you've deployed your application, it might, you might need some downtime to fix the vulnerability and things like that. So it's always a good practice to make sure that what you're putting into the cluster is always clean and free from issues, vulnerabilities, and things like that. So in this video, let's take a look at how we can install Kubescape and how to run the Kubescape scan and how to fix. I'll give you some examples. I'm not going to go through the entire issues and vulnerabilities, but I'll give you a couple of examples of how to understand the issue and how to understand the vulnerability and how you can potentially fix the vulnerability. Okay. So in here, in the Kubescape directory, I'll put a link to this Github repository in the video description if you want to check this out. And I'm going to go into the docs directory and getting started guide. Okay, so to install Kubescape, we're going to run this command. So I always advise in all my videos, if you see a command like this, don't just run it. And the good thing about this documentation is it indeed says that what you got to do. We are a security product, so please read the file before you run it. So that's what I would advise anyone to do it. So you don't know what's inside the shell script. It might be something, suspicious. So have a look into this shell script. You just download it, read them line by line, read it line by line, and then make sure you're happy with it. And then you can come here and run this line. So this is an easy one-liner to install Kubescape in any distribution that you want, because the shell script itself finds out which operating system you are in, which architecture you're running the script on, and then it will download and install the correct package from the Github repository. Okay, so this is not just the only way to install. So there are like other installation methods. So if you take a look at the other installation methods, so that's what we saw. Okay, so which is what we are going to do that. And you can also specify a version. If you want to install a very specific version of Kubescape, you can do that by passing the version. So if you're using Arch, you can use A-S Kubescape. And if you're in Ubuntu, you can install a repository and then install Kubescape from there. Obviously, if you're in Mac, you can use brew install Kubescape, Chocolatey, Crew, and even if you're using Crew plugin, I've done a video on Crew, which is a plugin manager for Kubernetes. So once you've got Crew installed, which Crew itself is a plugin, and once you install that plugin, you can install additional Kubernetes plugins through that. So Kubescape can be installed as a plugin to kubectl, and you can run Kubescape by running kubectl kubescape. Okay, and if you're on Ubuntu or any OS where you've got Snap installed, then you can install via Snap as well. I used to use NixOS, but I'm now back to Ubuntu on my server. But if you're using NixOS, again, there's this configuration that you can add, and you should be able to install Kubescape. Okay, so that's how we install. And in our case, I've already gone through this shell script. It all looks clean. So I'm going to just run this. Okay, so let me log into my Linux workstation. which is Ubuntu 22.04, and I'm recording this on a MacBook, and I've logged into, in my MacBook terminal, I've logged into my Linux workstation, and which is where I'm going to do all my work. Alright, so let's paste that, and it's going to install Kubescape. So don't worry if you've already installed Kubescape by this method. It is going to remove any old version that you've previously installed, and then it will install a new version. Okay, so that's done, and it's been installed to .kubescape directory, and it also tells you what you need to do to get Kubescape in your path. So we got to do, so before that, if I do which Kubescape, you won't find it because Kubescape got installed under .kubescape under your home directory. Okay, if I do ls .kubescape bin, and there we go. So that's our Kubescape binary, which is installed in .kubescape under your home directory. So you need to add that to your path. If you're going to be using this often, then I would advise you to add this line to your bash rc or zshrc file. For me, I'm just testing this. I'm not going to use this. So let me export it just for this session. And if I do which Kubescape, I find Kubescape now. Okay, so there's Kubescape help if you want to know a detailed about any single command. So you've got different commands. So the most common commands that you will use are list to find out the available frameworks, available controls, and most obviously you'll be using scan. So that's what Kubescape is for. And one other thing is, so we haven't got a cluster yet, so we can run the Kubescape scan against a live cluster or against a directory where you've got a whole bunch of manifests. Okay, so let's do a scan against a live cluster. I don't have a cluster running now, but I'm going to deploy a cluster using my vagrant provisioning. But if you've got multiple Kubernetes cluster, you can pass the --kube context, and then pass in the kube context to which Kubernetes cluster, to which Kubernetes context you want to run the scan against. Okay, so in my case, I'm just going to deploy just one Kubernetes cluster. Let's do that. So cd to repos directory, I don't have anything, so I'm going to git clone my Kubernetes repository, and then cd to Kubernetes vagrant provisioning. So you would have seen me doing this on all my videos just because I want to show you from scratch how I set up the cluster and do things. Okay, so in here I'm going to do vagrant up ---- provider libvirt, which is going to take about 4 minutes or so. Alright, so I'm going to pause the video and come back when it's done. Okay, so the command completed. It took less than 4 minutes. And let's set up the Kubernetes configuration file. Create .kube directory, scp etc kubernetesadmin.conf, from the kmaster to our local host. The password is kubeadmin. If I do kubectl cluster info, our cluster is up, kubectl get nodes. Okay, so all our nodes are ready. We are running Kubernetes cluster 1.29.1, kubectl get pods. Okay, so I don't see any issues with our cluster. It's all looking clean. And now let's do our Kubescape scan. Kubescape scan. Okay, so let's do Kubescape scan, and it's doing its initialization, which will take a few minutes. Sorry, not few minutes, few seconds. There's this little animation here. Okay, so we have some reports here, and we have a compliance score against 2 frameworks, and we can run individual scan against these individual frameworks. So NSA, MITRE, so these are all frameworks. So you can do Kubescape list frameworks to see a list of available frameworks that you can use, but by default it uses the NSA and the MITRE framework. Okay, so let's do this one here. Kubescape scan framework NSA. And again, every time you run Kubescape scan, it's going to take few seconds during the initialization. And you can see here, these are all the control names. So controls are like checks it performs. So there are different controls, and you can also see Kubescape list controls. Okay, so if you do that, there will be loads of controls, and yeah, you can see loads of controls. So this is the control ID, and that's the control name. Anonymous user has role binding, service account token mounted. So these are like different checks that Kubescape performs, and these are the control IDs. And you've got a URL, you've got a link to each control, so that gives you detailed about each of the controls, what it tests for, and how to fix that controls. If there's a vulnerability found under that control, this URL will also have some suggestion on how to fix the vulnerability or issue and things like that. Okay, so let's do Kubescape scan again. So this Kubescape scan is running the scan against our entire cluster. And what you can do is, if you want to run this scan against a particular namespace, you can do that. So there is an option -- include namespaces, and there's also an option -- exclude namespaces. So you can run the scan against the entire Kubernetes cluster, but if you want to just exclude one or two namespaces, you can do that. So Kubescape scan -- include namespaces. Let's say I want to include kube system namespace. Okay, so let's say I want to include just the default namespace, and this scan will be run against all the resources just in the default namespace. And by the way, this is comma separated list of namespaces. If you want to include multiple namespaces, for example, default kube system, and you can run that. And similarly, if you want to run the scan against the entire cluster, but if you want to leave out one or two namespaces, then you can do exclude namespaces. So that will run the scan exclude, if I spelled it correctly, exclude namespace, then it will run the scan against all the namespaces except default and kube system. So you can do things like that. Okay, right. Let's do Kubescape scan without specifying any namespaces so that it runs against all the namespaces, and then we can have a look at some of the controls and the results. Okay, so the controls checks and the results are categorized. These set of controls are related to access control, and there's this one related to secrets, missing network policy related to network, and all workload related controls. So let's take one for an example. Okay, so let's take privileged container. So privileged container is a control check performed by the Kubescape scan. And if you want to know more details about this particular scan, you can run Kubescape scan and passing it the control argument and passing the control ID. So C0057 is the control ID for privileged container. So remember, I did the command Kubescape list controls, so that will give you the control ID and the control name. And if you don't want to run Kubescape scan, if you don't want to run all the controls on your cluster, and if you just want to know privileged container, if you just want to know if you've got any containers that have the privileged mode enabled, then you can just run this command, this control, just one control, not all the controls. Okay, let's copy that and let's run it. So this Kubescape scan, we are specifying just one control. We want to check this control on our Kubernetes cluster, and this control, we know it's a privileged container. Okay, and we see that there are two resources affected, which is high severity, and you get a compliance score of 83%, which means, so the compliance score is calculated based on the number of failed resources in relation to the total resources in your cluster. So there are like 12 containers, out of which 2 containers failed on this control check. So the compliance score is 83%. If there were just 2 containers and the 2 containers failed, then the compliance score would be 0. So it will be calculated in that way. Okay, so if I scroll above, you can see here the 2 resources that failed. So one is the daemon set named CSI node driver in the Calico system namespace. The other one is another daemon set named Calico node in the Calico system namespace. So these 2 daemon sets have containers that are running in a privileged mode. So that's why these are flagged as high severity findings. So how to fix that? Okay, so this is the assisted remediation given by the Kubescape scan tool. So the containers, so this one I can already see container of 0, containers of 1. So there's this list of containers. So this particular daemon set has got 2 containers, and all you have to do to fix this vulnerability is to add security context privileged equal to false to your container definition, to both of your container definition in this daemon set. And for this Calico node, there is only one container, and if you add security context privileged equal to false in your container specification in this daemon set, this severity would disappear. Okay, so if you want to know more about this control name for each and every control name, so there is this corresponding URL, and if I copy that and let's paste that, and it will give you what this is all about. So that's the container, sorry, the control ID, the control name. So these are all the frameworks in which this control is listed. So if you run Kubescape scan mitre or Kubescape scan framework NSA, this control will be included. So this says in which all frameworks this control is included, and this control is of high severity, and it says what this control is about. Okay, what does this control test? Okay, it says if the pod specification, in the pod specification, if security context or privileged is set to true, then this control will be raised. Okay, so the description, why this is a security issue. A privileged container is a container that has all the capabilities of the host machine. Attackers who gain access to a privileged container can get access to the host resources. So obviously that's a security issue, so that's why it's being flagged. So let's go back to our terminal. For each and every control, you get the corresponding URL which has all the information about the controls and the possible remediation step. Okay, so I'm not going to fix this severity, fix this issue, fix this vulnerability, whatever, because this is not my part. So this is Calico system. There must be a valid reason why the daemon set for Calico is the container networking interface, the overlay network that we deploy in our Kubernetes cluster. So it needs to have access to the underlying network on the host system. So that's why it has created the container with privileged mode. So I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to mess with my container, mess with my Kubernetes cluster. But instead, what I can show you is I can show you a scan against my own manifest and see how we can fix it. So we've seen that. So far, what we have done is we've been running the Kubescape scan against the live cluster, and we've seen how to identify a particular control and what the control is about and what the remediation step is. Okay, and now what we're going to do is I'm inside my Kubernetes repository checked out under Vagrant Provisioning directory. If I go one level up, there is this YAMLs directory, cd to YAMLs, and if I do an ls, so these are all the list of a collection of manifests that I had been using on all my YouTube videos. So let's do a scan in this directory. So we're doing a static scan. We're not doing a scan against the live cluster. So we're just doing a scan against a bunch of manifests. So if I do Kubescape scan dot. So dot is the current directory. So it's not going to scan the cluster. Instead, it's going to scan all the manifests in this current directory. Let's do that. So we have the result. So we have controls under the workload category, controls under network category being flagged with some vulnerabilities or issues. So we have 27 resources where we have these issues, non-root containers, missing network policy. Okay, so let's do the non-root containers. Okay, and in order to get more details, we are going to run Kubescape scan and pass in the control ID so that we get more information about that specific control, and it's going to give a detailed information about all the resources that failed that particular control check. Okay, copy and paste it. And again, remember, if you do Kubescape scan control and pass in the control ID, you are running this against the live cluster. If you want to run this against the directory for all the manifests, then you have to specify the dot, which means the current directory. Okay, so we have 27 resources, and all the 27 resources failed this check, non-root containers. So that's why our compliance score is 0%. And this is of medium severity, not high severity. It's just medium severity. And if you scroll above, it gives you the list of all the 27 resources that failed. Okay, and the corresponding remediation step that you can take in order to fix that issue. Okay, so let's take a look at the last one. I'm not going to fix everything, but I'm just going to take a look at one of them. Okay, so in the YAMLs directory for nfs nginx.yaml, let's just run the Kubescape scan against that one file and then try to fix the vulnerability in that file. Okay, let's clear the screen. Kubescape scan. Okay, so previously I was running Kubescape scan against the entire directory, and now I'm running it against just one manifest file. Okay, so as expected, we have two issues: non-root containers and missing network policy. One resource, and in order to get more information, I'm going to run this command, and again I'm going to run this command against that particular manifest. So all I'm doing is verifying a very specific manifest for any vulnerabilities or issues. Okay, so there's one medium severity issue that we have, which is non-root container. 1 of 1 failed, so compliance score is 0. Non-root containers, let's take a look at what this check is about. Okay, so again, this control is included in all these frameworks. Description. Okay, so container engine allows containers to run application as a non-root user with non-root group membership. Typically, this setting is configured when the container image is built. Okay, having non-root execution integrated at the build time provides better assurance. Okay, while the run as user directory effective forces non-root execution and deployment encourages to build container to execute as a non-root user. So we haven't specified our container to run as a non-root user, which means our container is being run as a root user, which is a security issue. Okay, so what does this control test? Verify if run as user and run as group are set to the user ID greater than 999. Check that the allow privilege escalation field is set to false. And remediation, it gives you what you need to do to remediate this situation. And then it also gives you an example, security context. If you set security context allow privilege escalation to false, also if you set security context run as user to anything other than root user, then this vulnerability should be gone. Okay, let's go back to the terminal. Okay, so here it says security context run as root user true, security context allow privilege escalation equal to false. So what is the manifest here? So the manifest is for NFS nginx.yaml. So that's what we are going to do now. Okay, so run as non-root true. Let's copy that. Actually, let me copy the whole thing. And then I'm going to edit for NFS nginx.yaml, and this is the deployment. I'm going to go to the container specification, and let's paste that. Okay, so run as non-root user is going to be true, and then I'm also going to what is it? Is it allow privilege escalation? What is it? Okay, I think it's allow privilege escalation to false. I think allow privilege escalation equal to false. Yes, that's right. So we have made changes to our manifest as per the suggested remediation steps. So now let's run the scan again and see if it has fixed our issue. Kubescape scan control. Okay, so there we go. So we have one resource and non-root container is fine and 100% compliant. So if I do Kubescape scan without passing the control, so now it's again doing the scan, all scans, not a particular control, all scan against this manifest. So we should still have one issue to fix. Yes, missing network policy. And if I do this command against that manifest file, it's going to show you what we need to do to fix. It might not be as easy as our previous issue. Say it doesn't give you the assisted remediation. This is because the network policy, it can be anything. There's no single network policy. It's not a single option that you set in your manifest. So you can have a look in this, and possibly you might have an example of how to fix it. If not, you have to add a network policy. Severity is medium. This control detects workloads that has no network policy configured. If a network policy is not configured, it means that your applications might not have necessary control over the traffic to and from the pods. possibly leading to a security vulnerability. Okay, so remediation is review the workload identified by this control and assess whether it's necessary to configure a network policy for them. Okay, so in our case, we don't need a network policy. If we need a network policy, just add the network policy and then the issue will disappear. Okay, so that is how you identify you run the scan, you understand what the severity is, you understand what the control name is, and for each control, as I said, you will have the URL which gives you detailed information of what the control is about, in which framework this control is included, and what the remediation steps are. And in some cases, the URL will also have some examples of how to fix your issue, and then you run it against your cluster, you run it against your manifest before deploying to your cluster and things like that. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to mention is, let's say you're running this Kubescape scan against this manifest and it's coming out as missing network policy. So it says there is one medium severity issue where the container specification is missing the network policy, and you understand, you analyze the manifest, and you know that you don't need to have the network policy. So in which case, in cases like these, where you have actually analyzed the situation and you realize that you don't need this network policy, you can add exceptions or exclusions. So if you go to the directory here, getting started with Kubescape, you'll have lots of examples, and there's also this exceptions here. There is readme Kubescape exceptions. Kubescape exceptions is a proper way of excluding failed resources from affecting the risk score. Okay, so in here I could add an exception. So exception is like you add a separate file and you add that file while running the Kubescape scan, and all the resources defined in that exception file will be excluded from the Kubescape scan. So in this case, if I added an exception for this control for my resource deployment nginx deploy, then it would say it didn't fail, so it was excluded. So the compliance score would be 100% because this particular control on this particular resource was excluded, was specified in the in the exception list. Okay, so that is it for this video. So the project is Kubescape in the GitHub repository. There's loads and loads of documentations here. Okay, so that is it for this video. I'll see you all in my next video. Until then, keep learning and keep on learning. Bye bye.